On a rocky trail where the world had forgotten her, a young widow brought forth life alone. The sky was pitiless, the earth her only witness. Yet when despair threatened to claim her, a quiet Apache rider appeared, and from that moment, nothing would ever be the same. The trail stretched on without mercy. Jagged stone and hard-packed dust lay beneath a pale and indifferent sky, and the wind carried with it the thin wail of loneliness across the ridges. Clara Whitcomb stumbled along that path with the weight of more than grief pressing down upon her. Her belly, swollen and taut, cramped with the relentless surges of pain that promised birth would come before sundown. She had no midwife, no wagon, no husband. Only the silence of the land and the ache of abandonment. Her wagon train had moved on without her. Faces turned away, voices hushed when she begged them to wait. Too much trouble, they had said. Too much risk with her time so near. And so she had been left behind, a widow heavy with child, a liability cut loose on the edge of wilderness. By late afternoon, the sky grew crueler, the sun a hard coin that burned against her shawl. Clara's knees buckled, and she found herself on a rocky rise, the land dropping into gullies on both sides. Her hands clawed the ground as the wave of pain claimed her. She bit her lip until she tasted blood. The earth was her bed, the dust her pillow, and every cry she smothered in her sleeve lest some wandering predator hear. The child came as dusk bent low upon the hills. Her body shook, her voice raw with the labor, and at last a frail cry split, the silence thin, high, defiant against the wilderness. Clara cradled the child to her chest, tears and sweat mingling as she pressed her lips to the boy's downy head. He was alive. Against the cruelty of all else, he was alive. But the night, air was sharp, descending quick as a knife. The child's tiny body trembled against her breast. Clara pulled her shawl around them both, rocking forward and back upon the cold earth, whispering what comfort she could. Fear hollowed her. If cold did not take the infant, hunger or wolves surely would. It was then she heard the sound, a hoof striking stone. Her breath caught, heart pounding. She clutched the child close, shrinking against the rocks as a figure emerged upon the ridge above. A horse moved slow and steady, and upon its back sat a man with dark braids falling against his shoulders, his silhouette outlined by the faint rim of moonlight. An Apache. Every tale she had heard from the settlers flared to life, whispers of raids, of scalps taken, of cruelty without measure. Panic surged. Her arms tightened around the child, though she knew her rifle lay far from reach. The rider did not speak. He dismounted in one fluid motion, boots soft upon the stones. Clara's pulse roared in her ears. He came no closer than 10 paces, his face unreadable, his eyes dark as obsidian pools. He studied her as one might study a wounded animal, cautious, not unkind. Then he turned away, struck flint to kindling, and coaxed a fire to life between them. Sparks leapt upward, carried by the wind, before dissolving into night. Clara watched, trembling as he shed the blanket from his shoulders and set it near her without a word. The heat of the flames reached her chilled skin, and the scent of smoke wove into the air. Still, he did not approach. He crouched by the fire, silent, his gaze on the flames rather than her. She clutched her child tighter, confusion warring with fear. If he meant harm, why did he not strike? If he meant to rob her, why had he brought fire instead of blade? The boy whimpered in her arms, rooting weakly. She shifted her shawl, allowed him to feed, and in that intimate silence she realized the Apache was not watching her. He was keeping watch on the darkness beyond, his rifle resting across his knees, his ears attuned to the hills. Hours passed. The moon climbed. The fire burned steady, and still the stranger did not leave. Clara's exhaustion swam through her veins, dragging her head low, though terror urged her to resist sleep. Yet as she drifted, she saw his shape unmoving, a sentinel against the wilderness. When dawn's first gray light softened the horizon, she woke to the smell of bitter herbs steeping in a tin cup near the fire. The Apache poured water from a leather skin, his movements unhurried, deliberate. Clara shifted, clutching her child close, but the man did not glance her way. He set the cup upon a flat stone, stood, and looked toward the rising sun. For a long moment they regarded one another across the fire. She met his eyes then, and what she saw there was not the savage her people had warned of, but a man carved by sorrow, quiet, weathered, scarred by a life she could not imagine. No words passed. None were needed. The blanket lay across her shoulders. The child stirred and sighed, and in the fragile silence between them, Clara realized that pride would not keep her alive, nor fear, nor the memory of those who had abandoned her. Survival now depended on the presence of this stranger, a man who had appeared out of the wilderness with fire and patience and had not walked away. The trail had left her stripped bare, raw as the stones beneath her knees. Yet in the quiet watch of the Apache's eyes, she felt for the first time in many months that she was not entirely alone. The days that followed blurred into a slow, deliberate rhythm. Each hour stretched long upon the open land. Clara cradled her son in her arms, while the stranger, Taji, she had come to learn by the rhythm of his name spoken once under his breath, walked beside the mare she rode. His steps were measured, his gaze always sweeping the ridges and gullies as though he expected the very earth to rise against them. Clara studied him when she dared, from the safety of her shawl's shadow. He bore an old rifle across his back, polished from use but worn smooth where hands had gripped it too many times. His hair fell in dark braids, tied with strips of rawhide. A line of pale scar cut across the curve of his cheek, another disappearing beneath his collar. He walked with the silence of a hunter, each motion precise as though nothing in his life had ever been wasted. At first, Clara's heart beat quick with fear whenever their eyes met, but slowly it changed. The longer she watched him, the more she realized that his vigilance was not for her, but for what might come upon them. He watched the trail, the sky, the whisper of movement in the brush. His silence carried a weight, but also a strange comfort, as though words were no substitute for the steady presence of a man who had no need to prove his strength. Memories came unbidden to Clara as they traveled. Perhaps it was the endless horizon that loosened them from where they had been buried. She remembered her husband, Samuel, lying fevered in a camp outside Independence, his once strong hands trembling as she wiped his brow with a rag dipped in water. He had been a kind man, if not ambitious, and she had loved him in the quiet, steady way women love men who promise safety. When the fever took him, it stripped not only his life but the shield of belonging she had worn as his wife. She remembered the whispers afterward, women clutching their shawls tighter as she passed, men looking at her with something like pity, but not enough kindness to act on it. She had been left behind in more ways than one, an unwanted burden to those who had no patience for a widow heavy with child. Even her own kin, stern folk in Missouri, had turned from her after she had married Samuel Whitcomb, a farmer beneath the dignity of her family's name. When she wrote for help, silence was all that returned. Her loneliness had become a second skin, pressed tight against her bones. Only the child in her arms softened its edges. He rooted at her breast now, with small urgent sighs, his warmth steady against her heart. She whispered to him as they rode, half to comfort him, half to soothe herself, the words falling like prayer into the dry air. At night, when Taji built their small fires, she watched how the light flickered across his features. The scars told, of battles she could not name, of years carved by violence and survival. He never spoke of them. His silence was not cold, but it was heavy, carrying a history she knew would never be offered to her in words. And yet his stillness near the fire, his watchful gaze turned outward into the dark, was a language all its own. Clara often wondered if her suffering was mirrored in his. She thought of the way he sometimes touched the small pouch that hung from his belt, fingers resting against it as if upon a wound. She wondered who he had lost, what graves haunted him, what homes he no longer had. One evening, after they had eaten bread and dried meat in silence, Clara's eyes lingered on the rifle laid beside him. It was old but cared for, like everything about him. Her own husband's rifle had been left behind when the wagon train abandoned her, too heavy for her arms to carry along with child and shawl. That loss stung more now, knowing she could not protect her son if trouble came. Yet here sat this quiet Apache, his rifle near, his presence a wall between her and the shadows. Her pride still resisted. It whispered that she owed him nothing, that his company was no true choice but a necessity of her weakness. But when the wind shifted through the canyons and the cry of a wolf lifted into the air, she drew her son closer and looked across the fire at the man who did not sleep. And in her heart she felt the fragile beginning of gratitude. Another night, as rain threatened on the horizon, she pulled her shawl tighter about her shoulders and found herself speaking softly, not to him, but to the fire. He was a good man, she whispered, thinking of Samuel. Her words drifted into the smoke, perhaps carried away, perhaps heard. Taji did not look at her, did not answer, but his hand reached forward and placed another stick upon the flames. Somehow that simple act steadied her more than any comfort words could have offered. In his silence, she began to understand something she had not realized before. Survival was not only food and water, not only fire against the cold. It was bearing, grief without breaking. It was continuing to walk a trail even when the heart was torn and hollow. It was perhaps recognizing the same brokenness in another and finding in it not weakness, but kinship. As she lay with her son curled against her breast that night, the fire dimming low, Clara realized she was not the only one left behind by the world. The change came sudden like a door slammed shut. One morning the sky carried a dull, heavy weight, clouds rolling low and gray, their bellies swollen with rain. The horizon, once wide and endless, now pressed close around them, the air thick and restless. By afternoon the storm broke. Rain fell in great sheets, striking the land with a fury that turned dust to mire and stone to slick treachery. Thunder rolled through the canyons, each clap like the crack of judgment from heaven itself. Clara clutched, her son to her breast as Taji led the mare down the treacherous path, his shoulders bowed against the wind, his braid plastered dark against his neck. The child whimpered and twisted, his cries thin and broken by gasps. At first, Clara thought it was only the storm that frightened him, but when she pressed her palm against his forehead, a dread coldness swept her. The boy burned with fever. His tiny body, so fragile, radiated heat like a coal, and every whimper struck her heart with the weight of despair. Panic seized her. "No," she whispered, rocking him, her words drowned in the downpour. "Please, not you. Not now." She had lost too much already. Her husband, her place among the wagons, her family's regard. She could not, would not, lose the child who was all she had left. Her voice broke, her tears mixing with the rain. She looked to Taji then, desperation naked in her eyes. He met her gaze for a single moment, and in that moment his calm steadied her, though no words passed between them. He only nodded once, a gesture that seemed to say, "Hold fast, I will not falter." When at last they found the shell of a cabin half hidden among cottonwoods, Taji pushed the door open with his shoulder. Inside was damp and shadowed, but it kept out the rain. He set to work without hesitation, gathering dry wood from beneath the eaves, coaxing fire where there seemed no hope of flame. Clara huddled near the hearth, rocking her fevered child, every cry from the boy a dagger driven deeper into her ribs. The stranger moved with surety. From his pouch he drew a twist of dried leaves, bitter-smelling, and dropped them into boiling water. He poured the draught into a small cup, cooled it with careful patience, then knelt before Clara. His hand did not touch hers, but he set the cup within reach. His eyes met hers, steady, expectant. Her instinct balked. How could she trust what she did not know? Yet the child whimpered again, tiny lips dry, his skin too hot. Clara's hands trembled as she touched the cup to her son's mouth. The boy swallowed weakly, a few drops at first, then more. His cries softened, though the fever still raged. The storm battered the cabin through the long night, rain striking the roof like thrown stones, wind howling down the chimney. Clara fought sleep, clutching her son, whispering prayers she had half forgotten. But exhaustion bore her down, Her eyes closed, her body swaying with weariness until she realized the child was no longer in her arms. She started upright, fear clawing at her chest, only to see Taji seated in the rocking chair by the fire, her son cradled against him. The chair creaked slow and steady, back and forth, his great hands gentle on the small bundle. The firelight touched his face, revealing lines of strain around his eyes, a weariness he carried without complaint. Clara watched him through blurred vision, every instinct torn between fear and gratitude. He had taken the child not to harm, but to grant her rest. His head bent low, his lips moving in silence. Not words she knew, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a memory spoken into the night. The fever fought hard through the hours, but near dawn its grip weakened. Clara pressed her hand against her son's skin and found him cooler, his breath steadier. Relief flooded her so fierce that she nearly wept again. She turned her gaze toward the man in the chair. He had not slept. His eyes were closed now. Head bowed, but his arms still held her son with infinite care, as though he carried not only a child but the weight of something sacred. When morning broke, pale light slipping through the cracks of the cabin, Clara rose stiffly and moved closer. Her shawl brushed against his arm as she took the child back, careful not to wake him. Taji's eyes opened at the touch, dark and heavy-lidded with exhaustion. For the first time she saw in him not only the hunter, not only the sentinel, but the man, the bone-deep weariness, the scars that told of battles long past, the patience of one who had known loss and still chose to hold on. She wanted to thank him, but words failed. Gratitude lived too deep in her chest to be shaped into sound. Instead, she simply held his gaze for a long moment, and in her silence, he seemed to understand. The storm outside had passed, leaving the world washed clean, though the earth was sodden and the air heavy with the smell of rain. Clara stepped outside the cabin with her son against her shoulder, looking at the horizon softened by mist. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt a fragile thread of hope, thin as a green shoot breaking through rain-soaked soil. Behind her, the cabin door creaked as Taji stepped into the morning, his rifle slung across his back. He did not speak, but when his eyes met hers, she felt the truth settle between them like an unspoken vow. While the world had turned its back, he had not. He had stood through storm and fever when no one else would, and Clara knew with the certainty of one who has been to the edge of despair and returned, that trust had begun to take root within her heart. The storm passed, leaving behind a raw and dripping silence. Streams trickled down gullies where dust once reigned, and the cottonwoods wore heavy cloaks of rain. It was then, wandering from the shelter that had saved them, that Clara and Taji found another, a cabin half sunk into the earth, its roof sagging but still sound, its door hanging crooked on its hinges. It was not much, yet after days of exposure it felt like a blessing. The hearth bore old ash, gray as bone. A rocking chair lingered by the window, one leg repaired with care but long ago. The smell of age and dust clung to the air. Clara laid her son on a folded shawl near the fire, while Taji set about mending the hearth with kindling. Soon, smoke curled upward, filling the cabin with the scent of life and warmth. Still, the shelter brought with it a different kind of unease. Within those four walls, silence pressed heavier. Outside, the land's vastness had kept them at a distance, but here they moved in close quarters, their steps echoing too loudly. They became like two wary animals sharing the same den, each aware of the other, careful not to cross invisible lines. At the table, Clara tore bread in halves and offered one to him. He accepted it with the same grave nod he gave to everything, no more, no less. His tools lay on the bench nearby, an old knife sharpened so many times its blade had grown thin, and the pouch of herbs that had steadied her son. They spoke of long years of survival, of a man who carried little but carried it well. Her shawl dried by the fire, hanging beside his rifle. That simple sight, a woman's garment beside a weapon, felt fragile, intimate, like glass that might shatter at a careless word. Clara sat by the hearth, her son dozing against her breast, and found herself wondering what it meant to share space with a man again. Not as a wife, nor as a woman scorned by whispers, but as something quieter, unspoken. Tension thickened the days that followed. Taji repaired the cabin roof, driving wedges of wood beneath sagging beams while Clara mended her son's swaddling with thread drawn from an old scrap. They did not speak, yet the rhythm of their labor grew like a song played in counterpoint, different notes, yet bound together. She could not name the bond, only feel it growing, delicate but steady. It was late one afternoon when the sound of approaching voices froze her heart. She gathered her child close as two figures appeared at the cabin door. Settlers, rough in their coats and boots, rifles slung across shoulders. Their eyes swept the room, lingered too long on Clara, then narrowed upon Taji. "Well now," one said, his tone sharp with disdain, "what's a woman like you doing holed up with one of them?" Clara's throat tightened. Old shame stirred, the kind she had carried since her wagon train had turned their backs. She felt the heat of their judgment, the sneer curling in the corners of their mouths, the doubt that her presence with Taji could be anything but disgrace. The second man chuckled low. "You need rescuing, ma'am? Can't imagine you'd want his company." His gaze slid over her with the same unkind familiarity she remembered from town, when widows were no longer seen as women deserving respect, but as prey. Fear rose, but stronger than fear was something else. She looked toward Taji. He stood still, silent, his rifle within reach but untouched, his face carved in stone. He would not answer their words, he had no need. The choice, Clara realized, lay with her. She straightened, her son warm and steady against her chest, and let her voice fall quiet, but firm. "He is my protector." The words startled even her as they left her lips, yet once spoken, they rang with truth. She repeated them, her chin lifted, her tone carrying the weight of her conviction. "He is my protector, and you'll leave us be." For a heartbeat, the cabin held its breath. The settlers exchanged glances, unsettled, uncertain. Their smirks faltered. At last, one spat upon the ground and muttered, "Suit yourself." With a backward glance heavy with resentment, they turned and left, their boots crunching away into the fading light. The silence that followed was different than before. Clara felt her pulse still racing, but beneath it a new steadiness grew. For the first time since her abandonment, she had claimed her place without shame. The words had been born of necessity, but they revealed something truer than she had realized. That night, the air between her and Taji shifted. The fire burned low, its glow painting the cabin in warm hues. Clara sat in the rocking chair, her son asleep in her arms, while Taji sat nearby, carving a length of wood with careful strokes. No words were spoken, yet his presence carried a quiet gravity that reached her more deeply than any man's promises ever had. Clara's heart whispered its confession in silence. She was no longer ashamed of this man's presence. She felt safer in his watch than she had in the company of her own kind. Whatever bond stretched between them, it was no longer one of necessity alone. She rocked her son slowly, the old chair creaking, the fire's warmth settling into her bones. For the first time in years, dignity did not feel like something she had to beg or fight for. It was hers, reclaimed, forged in the presence of firelight and the quiet strength of a man who asked for nothing, yet gave everything. Time moved not in days, but in the slow accumulation of small labors. The cabin, once a ruin, grew into a home beneath their hands. Taji mended the roof with branches cut from the cottonwoods, wedging them beneath sagging beams until the leaks slowed to a whisper. Clara, seated by the hearth, stitched torn cloth into swaddling, her needle flashing in the firelight. The rhythm of their days was wordless but steady. Coffee boiled at dawn in a blackened pot. Wood split at dusk with an axe that rang sharp against the stump. The child rocked to sleep by either set of arms. It was not marriage, nor courtship, nor anything she could have named, but it was life shared. Each gesture took on a weight beyond itself. When Taji left a cup of water within her reach, when Clara folded his blanket beside her shawl, when their hands brushed in passing as they traded a piece of bread, their silence became full, not empty. Clara's son grew stronger in those weeks, his cries louder, his laughter quickening. Often she would wake in the night to see Taji by the hearth, the boy in his arms, rocking him slow in the chair. The sight filled her with a tenderness so sharp it ached. She wondered if Taji saw in the child some echo of what he had lost, or if he simply carried an instinct to protect that could not be stilled. Yet the wilderness did not forget them. One night, long after the fire had burned low, Clara woke to the sound of horses outside. The child stirred against her breast, and her heart leapt into her throat. She rose, clutching him as the door burst inward. Men entered, 4 of them, rough-faced and armed, rifles catching what little glow remained in the coals. Raiders, their eyes sharp with hunger and cruelty. Taji was already on his feet. He did not shout or curse. He moved with the calm ferocity of a man who had fought before and would fight again. His rifle was in his hands before the first intruder fully crossed the threshold. The crack of gunfire filled the cabin, deafening, firelight flaring with each shot. Clara pressed herself against the wall, shielding her child, but terror warred with something fiercer. Her gaze fell on the rifle leaning in the corner, the one that had belonged to Samuel, her husband. Her hands shook as she reached for it, the weight heavy, unfamiliar. She remembered his hands guiding hers once in a field long ago, showing her how to steady the barrel, how to breathe before the trigger. She trembled, but she did not falter. Lifting the rifle to her shoulder, she aimed at the shadow near the window where another man pushed through. Her shot rang out, the recoil jolting her to the bone, but the figure crumpled, cursing as he fell back into the night. The skirmish raged with firelight flickering across sweat and smoke. Taji moved like a shadow, swift and sure, his braid swinging, his rifle firing, his knife flashing when one man lunged too near. Clara, though her arms quaked, reloaded as best she could, her teeth gritted in determination. The child cried out behind her, but she steeled herself with a mother's fury. No one would take him, not while breath remained in her body. At last, silence fell, broken only by the ragged breathing of the living. 2 men lay fallen outside the cabin, another fled into the night with blood staining his sleeve. The last lay groaning on the floor until Taji, without a word, dragged him out into the darkness and did not return him. Clara sank to her knees, clutching her son, her body trembling from head to heel. She looked up as Taji returned, his face unreadable, his rifle set gently against the wall. The firelight glimmered across his brow, damp with sweat, and the faintest mark of blood darkened his sleeve. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Not gratitude, for gratitude was too small. Not relief alone, though relief was fierce in her chest. It was recognition. That they had stood together, not by chance, not by necessity, but by choice. Clara rose slowly, still trembling, and set the rifle back against the wall. Her hands brushed against his as she did, rough and calloused, scarred by battles she could never know. For a moment they lingered, her fingers against his, not in fear but in something nearer to kinship, nearer to trust. Later, after the child had quieted and sleep once more pressed heavy upon the cabin, Clara sat in the rocking chair, her shawl around her shoulders. Taji sat nearby, sharpening his knife with steady strokes. The air between them carried no words, but the silence was full. Clara's heart, still unsettled by the violence, found steadiness in the memory of what had passed. She had stood with him. Together they had held the fragile life they had built against the darkness that sought to destroy it. Their companionship was no fragile thread to be cut at the world's whim. It had been tempered in fire, forged in danger. She looked toward him then, his head bent over the blade, the firelight casting him in bronze and shadow, and she realized with a clarity that left her breathless. Love could be quiet. It could grow not in words or declarations, but in the steadfast presence of one who remained, in the courage to face danger side by side. And in that realization, Clara felt something she had thought forever lost stir alive within her chest. Spring crept upon the land like a hesitant promise. The snow that had once sealed the high passes thinned and slid away, dripping into rivulets that braided the slopes. Rivers swelled and roared, carrying branches and broken ice down from the mountains. Grass pushed through the thawing earth, and the air carried the sharp green scent of renewal. The cabin that had sheltered them through winter seemed smaller now, like a cocoon from which they had both emerged, changed. Clara stood at the doorway one morning, her child in her arms, and watched the world waking. The boy reached out toward the light, his tiny fist grasping at nothing and everything. She pressed her lips to his hair and felt a knot within her loosen. Yet beyond that door, beyond the pines and meadows, lay the world of towns, wagons, and eyes that judged. The thought returned often, to go back, to seek some echo of the life she had lost, some semblance of belonging among her own kind. She imagined walking into a town with her son on her hip and Taji at her side. She saw in her mind's eye the stiffening of shoulders, the whispers behind hands, the pitying or condemning looks. The weight of that scorn made her chest ache. She had lived beneath such glances before, and she knew how they hollowed a soul. And, yet if she remained here apart, she would not have to beg for a place. With Taji, life was spare but honest. Bread earned, wood split, water drawn, silence shared. She thought of his quiet strength, the patience with which he held her child, the way he met danger without flinching. He had not abandoned her when all others had. One evening, as the light faded to rose along the ridges, Clara watched her son crawl across the cabin floor. Taji sat nearby, his long braid loose down his back. The boy reached for it, caught it in his small fist, and laughed. Clara's breath caught. The sight was simple, almost laughably so, yet it struck her with the force of revelation. The child's trust was instinctive, uncalculated. To him, this man was safety. To him, the braid was a tether to all that was solid and enduring. Clara felt tears sting her eyes. Family, she realized, was not what others named it. It was not bound by bloodlines or sanctioned by churches. It was forged by presence, by the ones who stayed when all else fell away, by those who chose day after day not to leave. Her decision was no longer a question. She would not return to the towns that had turned their backs. She would not bow her head to those who measured worth by lineage or prejudice. Her dignity would not be begged for. It would be lived. The following morning, Clara gathered what little she owned. Her shawl, worn thin but still warm. The rifle that had been Samuel's, now cleaned and oiled. A bundle of cloth stitched with her own hands, filled with the child's, few garments. She looked around the cabin one last time, not in sorrow but in acknowledgement. It had sheltered them, taught them, borne witness to their transformation. But it was not meant to be their end. Taji saddled his horse in silence, his movements sure and steady. Clara approached, the child swaddled close against her chest. She hesitated only a moment before reaching up, placing her hand on his arm. He met her gaze, dark eyes steady as stone. No words passed, none were needed. She mounted behind him, the child cradled between them, pressed safe against his father's, heart though no blood bound them. The horse shifted, muscles bunching, ready to carry them into whatever lay beyond. As they rode from the clearing, the wind caught at her shawl, lifting its edge like a banner. The cabin disappeared behind the trees, swallowed by distance and memory. Before them stretched the open land, hills softening into plains, rivers cutting silver paths, the horizon wide and waiting. Clara leaned into Taji's back, the warmth of him steady beneath her cheek. The child stirred, then settled, lulled by the rhythm of hooves. For the first time in years, Clara felt no weight pressing her shoulders downward. Instead, she felt the pull of something forward, a current carrying her not back to what was lost, but on to what could yet be. She was not only a widow now, not only an outcast or a woman abandoned on a rocky trail. She was mother, companion, survivor. And beside her rode a man scarred but unbroken, whose silence held more truth than all the promises she had once been given. The trail bent westward, the sun at their backs spilling gold across the land. They rode not as widow and wanderer, not as outcast and enemy, but as something harder to name and stronger for it. As a family, scarred and whole, bound not by law or blood, but by the simple, enduring act of staying. And in the hush of that ride, Clara's heart whispered what her lips need never say. She had found not merely survival but a second chance, at dignity, at healing, at love.